For almost 2000 years, one people did not have their own country. Their capital was burned, their temple destroyed, and they were scattered across the world. The story was supposed to end there, but 2000 years later, they returned to the same land, the same city, to the same walls. How did the people survive 2000 years without territory? How did they return, and why did the land they returned to become the most disputed piece of land on the planet? 2000 years, one story. Let's go. It all starts with Rome, the 1st century of our era. Judea is an eastern province of the Roman Empire. The Jews lived here for more than 1000 years. 2 temples. The first was built by King Solomon, the son of David, the very one who killed Goliath. You know, the little shepherd boy with the stone against the giant in bronze armor. A story every child on the planet knows. The shepherd boy became a king and his son built the temple. Solomon's first temple stood for 400 years. Then came Nebuchadnezzar. Babylon, 586 years before our era. The temple was destroyed. The Jews were taken into captivity. 70 years in Babylon, the first exile. Then Cyrus the Persian, the same one from the narration about ancient civilizations, led the Jews return. They returned and built the second temple. The second was built after returning from Babylonian captivity. The Temple Mount in Jerusalem is the holiest place in Judaism. Rome controlled Judea through a local king, Herod the Great. You know, Herod was such a paranoid madman that he killed his own wife, mother-in-law, and 3 sons, suspecting them of conspiracy. Augustus said it was better to be Herod's pig than his son, because Herod, like a Jew, did not eat pork. Pigs were safe, sons were not. But Herod rebuilt the second temple, making it one of the wonders of the ancient world. The Temple Mount, a platform the size of 12 football fields, stones weighing 500 tons, gold, marble, pilgrims from all over the Mediterranean. And it is this temple that the Romans will burn 70 years later. After Herod, Rome appointed procurators, Pontius Pilate, that very one. Taxes increased, pressure increased, the Jews did not submit. Year 66, uprising. The Zealots raise a rebellion. Rome sends legions. Titus, the son of Emperor Vespasian, besieges Jerusalem. 5 months, 4 legions, 60,000 soldiers. The city is packed with pilgrims who came for Passover and found themselves trapped. Starvation, disease, internal strife. 3 Jewish factions fought each other inside the besieged city: the Zealots, the Sicarii, and the Moderates. They burned each other's grain supplies, killed each other in the streets. While the Romans built siege towers outside, the Jews destroyed themselves from within. You know, Jerusalem fell not only because Rome was strong, but because the defenders couldn't unite even in the face of destruction. This pattern will repeat. In the year 70, the temple fell, burned to the ground. Only the western wall remains. The Wailing Wall still stands. People have been coming and praying for 2000 years. At the wall that remains from the temple destroyed by an empire that has long since vanished. Masada, the last fortress. 960 zealots locked themselves on the top of a rock in the desert. The Romans built a siege ramp for 3 months. When they broke in, all the defenders were dead. According to legend, they chose death over slavery. You know, Masada is still a symbol. Israeli soldiers take their oath at the top of this rock. Masada shall not fall again. This phrase is spoken at every oath in the desert, on the top of the rock, where 900 people chose death over slavery. You know, historians argue whether there was a mass suicide. Josephus Flavius, the only source, was himself a questionable witness. But for Israel, Masada is not history, it is identity. Never again. This phrase is spoken every year on the top of that very rock in the desert under the stars. You know, an army that takes an oath at the site of a 2000-year-old mass suicide. This is not a ritual, it's a promise that defines the entire military doctrine of the country. Rome renamed Jerusalem, calling it Aelia Capitolina, and renamed the province. Judea became Palestine intentionally, to erase the people's connection to the land. The name Palestine, by the way, comes from the Philistines, ancient enemies of the Jews. Rome named the land after the enemy. This renaming is a punishment. Bar Kokhba, year 132. The last uprising. Shimon Bar Kokhba led the Jews against Rome for the second time. 3 years of guerrilla warfare. Initially successful, they recaptured Jerusalem, minted coins, declared independence. Then Rome sent 12 legions, 580,000 Jews killed, 1,000 villages destroyed. Emperor Hadrian forbade Jews from entering Jerusalem under penalty of death. The city they built 3,000 years ago is close to them for centuries. Diaspora, dispersion. Jews go to Babylon, to Egypt, to Spain, to Germany, to Poland, all over the world. Without a state, without an army, without territory, only the book, the Torah, and the belief that one day they will return. Do you know what's amazing? Any other people in such a situation would have dissolved, assimilated, forgotten their language, faith, and traditions in 2 generations at most. The Jews did not dissolve. For 2,000 years in dozens of countries on all continents, they preserved the language of prayers, preserved traditions, preserved the dream of returning. Next year in Jerusalem, a phrase repeated every Passover, every year for 2,000 years, in Spain and in Poland, in Germany and in Morocco, in Baghdad and in New York. One phrase, one city, one dream. Do you know how they survived? The synagogue. In every city, in every village where Jews lived, there was a synagogue. Not just a place of prayer, a school, a court, a community. A closed system that reproduced itself under any conditions. You can be expelled from the country, have your house burned, your property taken, but as long as there are 10 men and a Torah scroll, the community exists. A portable civilization without territory, without an army, only a book and faith. Meanwhile, something else was happening on the same land. 7th century, Islam. Arab conquests cover the Middle East in a few decades. Jerusalem is taken in 637. Caliph Umar enters the city. Muslims build the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount. The 3rd holiest site in Islam on the seat of the 1st holy seat in Judaism. One place, 2 religions, a problem that remains unresolved to this day. But you know what's interesting? In early Islam, Jews lived better than in Christian Europe. The status of zimmi, protected people, not equal to Muslims but protected by law. They paid a tax, lived freely. Maimonides, one of the greatest Jewish philosophers, lived and worked at the court of Saladin in Cairo. Try being a Jewish philosopher in medieval Europe. The stake, not the court. The golden age of Jewish culture in Muslim Spain. Poetry, philosophy, science. Jews and Muslims lived side by side until in 1492 the Catholic monarchs expelled both. Crusaders, 11th to 13th centuries. European knights come to liberate Jerusalem. They take the city in 1099. Blood up to the knees. Muslims and Jews are killed indiscriminately. 88 years later, Saladin retakes the city. You know, Saladin could have arranged a massacre like the Crusaders in 99, but he didn't. Who allowed Christians to ransom their freedom? Those who couldn't pay, he released. His brother ransomed 1,000 captives with his own money. You know, knighthood in the Middle East looked different than in Europe. Often more noble, then the Mamluks, then the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans ruled for 400 years. Palestine under the Ottomans was a quiet province. Jerusalem was a small city. Jews, Christians and Muslims lived side by side. Not always peacefully, but side by side. The land waited. You know, under the Ottomans in Palestine lived Arabs, Jews, Christians, Druze, Circassians. Small communities, poor, quiet. Jerusalem was a provincial town, not a capital, not a center. The backwater of an empire that looked to Istanbul and Cairo. No one expected that in 100 years, 5 armies would fight over this piece of desert. And in Europe, Jews lived very differently. Pogroms, expulsions. Spain, 1492. All Jews were expelled. Russia, the Pale of Settlement. Pogroms every few years. England expelled the Jews in 1290, France in 1306, Spain in 1492, Inquisition, pyres. The choice between baptism and death. Russia, the Pale of Settlement. Jews are forbidden to live in large cities. Pogroms are not spontaneous riots. This is organized violence. Chechnya, 1903, 49 killed, 500 injured. The police watched. France, the Dreyfus Affair. A Jewish officer accused of espionage he did not commit. Crowds in the streets shout, "Death to the Jews." In Paris, the capital of enlightenment, in the city of Voltaire and Rousseau, in the country that was the first in Europe to grant Jews civil rights. And 100 years later, it shouts at them, "Death," in the streets. And in Russia, the Kishinev pogrom, 1903, 49 killed, hundreds injured, 1,500 homes looted. The police stood by and watched. Newspapers wrote that the Jews were to blame themselves. You know, when the state does not protect and newspapers blame the victim. Leaving is not a choice, it's the only option. One journalist looked at the crowd. Theodor Herzl, a Viennese journalist, an assimilated Jew, spoke German, lived in a European way, and at that moment understood. No matter how much you assimilate, no matter how well you speak their language, to them you will always be different. The only solution is your own state. Herzl wrote the book The Jewish State, a thin brochure, 64 pages that changed the world. You know, there are books that describe the world, and there are books that create it. This was the latter. Herzl wrote the book, The Jewish State, a thin brochure, 64 pages. His friends thought he was crazy. His family is horrified. The rabbis are against it. The assimilated Jews are against it. The socialists are against it. Everyone is against it. Do you know what Herzl said after the first Congress in Basel? He wrote in his diary, "In Basel I founded the Jewish state. If I said it out loud, I would be met with universal laughter." In 5 years, maybe in 50, everyone will see it. He was not wrong. 51 years later. Herzl did not live to see it. He died at 44 from heart failure. His heart literally couldn't take it. 1897, the first Zionist Congress in Basel. Herzl gathers delegates. The goal is a Jewish state in Palestine. You know, Herzl considered other options. Argentina, Uganda. The British offered a piece of East Africa, but for most Jews there was only one answer. Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, the land they prayed for over 2,000 years. The first waves of immigration, Aliyah. Jewish settlers arrive in Palestine, buy land, drain swamps, build kibbutzim, collective farms, revive Hebrew, a language that for 2,000 years was only used for prayer. The first Aliyah, 1882. Young idealists from Russia flee from pogroms, build agricultural settlements. Most fail. Swamps, malaria, Arab neighbors who do not understand what is happening. The second Aliyah, 1904. After the Kishinev pogrom, socialists create kibbutzim, collective farms, communal property, communal labor, utopia in the desert. Some kibbutzim still exist today. Eliezer ben Yehuda, the man who single-handedly revived a dead language. His son became the first child in 2,000 years for whom Hebrew was native. You know, reviving a dead language is like restarting the heart of a civilization. No one had done it before, and no one has repeated it since. You know, Ben Yehuda was so obsessed that he forbade his wife and children from speaking any language at home other than Hebrew. The problem was that Hebrew didn't have words for half of the modern items: ice cream, newspaper, towel. Ben Yehuda invented words every day, thousands of words. One person, one language, one dream. And it worked. You know, Latin is dead, ancient Egyptian is dead, Sumerian is dead. No one revived them, but Hebrew was revived. One person, Ben Yehuda, forbade his wife and children from speaking any other language. His son grew up in isolation. Other children did not play with him because they did not understand. Fanaticism? Yes. But within a generation, the whole country spoke Hebrew. The First World War. The Ottoman Empire collapses. Britain takes control of Palestine and makes a promise. The Balfour Declaration, 1917. One letter, 67 words. The British government is favorably disposed to the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people. Of the Jewish people in Palestine. 67 words that will change the Middle East forever. The problem, Britain promised one land to two peoples. The Arabs were promised independence for their help in the war against the Ottomans. The Jews were promised a national home on the same territory. You know, when you sell one apartment to two buyers, the problem is not with the buyers. The problem is with the seller. You know, Balfour doesn't even mention Arabs by name. The text states that nothing should be done to prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Non-Jewish communities. 90% of the population is referred to as non-Jewish communities. You know, when you describe 90% of the population through negation, you've already made a choice. The 1920s and 30s. Jewish immigration is increasing. Arab protests are growing. Clashes, the uprising of 1936, the British are not coping. You know what happened? The Arab uprising of 1936, 3 years against the British and against Jewish immigration. Britain ruled harshly, but realized that holding on to Palestine was impossible. Two communities hate each other, and both hate Britain. A classic colonial trap. They try to limit Jewish immigration. The White Paper of 1939.
Quotas, restrictions, a maximum of 75,000 over 5 years.
At the moment when Hitler is already in power, when the Nuremberg laws are already enacted, when Kristallnacht has already occurred, when Jews in Europe need to flee the most, Britain closes the only door. Underground organizations. Haganah, the main one. Irgun, more radical. Lehi, even more radical. They smuggled immigrants illegally, attacked British facilities. The bombing of the King David Hotel in 1946. 91 killed. British, Arabs, Jews. You know, when three sides are fighting each other simultaneously in one territory, someone has to leave. The British left, then the Holocaust. Is 6 million. The third of the Jewish people exterminated. Gas chambers, death camps, industrial extermination of people. After the war, the survivors faced the question, where to go? Europe, which was killing them. America, which was closing its borders. Palestine, where the British do not allow them. Ships with Holocaust survivors arrive at the shores of Palestine. The British turn them back. You know, people who survived Auschwitz sail to the land they prayed for over 2,000 years and they are turned away. The world sees the photographs. Public opinion changes. The ship Exodus, 4,500 survivors, was intercepted at sea by the British and sent back to Germany. People who survived the German camps were sent back to Germany. The photographs went around the world. The British mandate became an international disgrace. The ship Exodus, 1947. 4,500 Holocaust survivors sailed to Palestine. The British fleet intercepts, and the passengers are forcibly returned to Germany. To Germany, the country that was killing them. The photographs went around the world. Britain lost the moral right to govern Palestine. A few months later, the issue was handed over to the United Nations. 1947. The United Nations votes for the partition of Palestine. 2 states, Jewish and Arab. The Jews agree. The Arab countries reject. Not an inch. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion stands in a small art museum in Tel Aviv, reading the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel. 11 minutes later, Truman recognizes Israel. A few hours later, 5 Arab armies invade: Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon. The goal: to strangle the state in its cradle. The War of Independence, 13 months, Israel survives. not only survives but expands territory beyond the partition plan. 6,000 Israelis killed, 1% of the population. Imagine your country losing 1% in a year. It's like Russia losing 1.5 million in 1 year. You know, the Israeli army in 48 is not an army, it's a militia. Haganah, an underground organization. Former partisans, survivors from the camps, who held weapons for the first time against 5 regular armies with tanks and aviation. And they won. Not because they are better armed, but because retreating. Beyond the sea, a world that has just killed 6 million and closed its borders. There is no third option, but a price was paid for this. About 700,000 Palestinian Arabs lost their homes. Some fled from the war, some were forced to leave. Palestinians call this Nakba, catastrophe. Many of these families still live in refugee camps. The third generation is just a few kilometers from the homes their grandparents lost. 1967, the Six-Day War. Egypt, Syria, and Jordan are gathering troops. Nasser closes the Strait of Tirane. Israel launches a preemptive strike. 6 days. Sinai, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and most importantly, the old city of Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, the Western Wall. For the first time in 2,000 years, Jews stand at their wall in their city. Soldiers cried, generals cried. Rabbi Goren blew the shofar at the wall. You know, for Jews around the world, it was a moment when history came full circle. Soldiers whose grandfathers fled from Europe stood at the wall their ancestors last saw 2,000 years ago. Paratroopers touched the stones and cried. You know, a stone wall, 2,000 years, and people cry touching it because it's not just a wall. It's proof that they were here, that they have returned, that 2,000 years of prayers were not in vain. Paratroopers at the wall, a photograph that became iconic. Young soldiers, some 20 years old, stand before stones that are 2,000 years old, crying, touching the wall. You know, these stones remember Titus, remember the Crusaders, remember Saladin, remember the Ottomans, remember the British, and now these boys in helmets. 2,000 years, and they returned. But the territories conquered in 67 became the beginning of a new conflict. Occupation, settlements, Palestinian resistance, intifadas, terrorist attacks, retaliatory operations, the wall, the blockade of Gaza, a cycle of violence that has lasted for decades. Settlements in the West Bank are growing. Each new settlement is a new turn in the conflict. Palestinians see the settlements as creeping annexation. Israel sees them as security and a historical right. 2 narratives, 1 territory, no solution. The First Intifada, 1987. Stones against tanks.
Children throw stones at armored personnel carriers. The photographs spread around the world.
David versus Goliath. Only this time, David is a Palestinian teenager and Goliath is the Israeli army. You know, the irony is that Israel, a country founded on the story of David, has found itself in the role of Goliath. 1973, Yom Kippur War. Egypt and Syria attack on Yom Kippur, the holiest day. Israel is caught by surprise. The first days are a disaster, then a counteroffensive. Israel survives, but the lesson is painful. Invincibility is a myth.
Old Amir, the prime minister, considered the nuclear option in the early days of the war. Operation Samson. Nuclear warheads were put on alert. You know, the world didn't know how close the Middle East was to nuclear war in October 1973. Closer than they think. The American airlift. Nixon sent planes with weapons, turning the tide of the war. Israel counterattacked, crossed the Suez Canal, surrounded the Egyptian army, from defeat to victory, but at the cost of thousands of lives and the illusion of invincibility. Then peace. Camp David, 1978. Sadat and Begin. Egypt was the first Arab country to recognize Israel. Sinai was returned. Sadat was killed for this 3 years later by his own military at a parade. You know, peace in the Middle East costs the life of the one who signs it. Sadat knew, he was told. He went to Jerusalem anyway, spoke in the Knesset before people he fought against 4 years ago and said, enough.
3 years later, a burst of gunfire at the parade. The officer who fired shouted, "I killed the pharaoh!" You know, Egypt lost its second leader for peace. Rabin was the third. Pattern that discourages the next ones from trying. The 90s, the Oslo Accords. Rabin and Arafat shake hands on the White House lawn. Clinton between there. A photograph that went around the world. Hope for two states. Rabin was killed in 1995 by Jewish extremist on Yizaudi Adoreshkia. For peace, the peace process died with him. Slowly, but died. Rabin stood in the square in Tel Aviv, sang a song of peace, received 2 bullets in the back from a Jew, not an Arab, from his own. You know, Sadat was killed by his own for peace with Israel. Rabin was killed by his own for peace with the Palestinians. A terrible pattern. In the Middle East, peace kills the one who proposes it. 2000, the Second Intifada, bus bombings, retaliatory operations, the security wall, unilateral withdrawal from Gaza in 2005. Hamas wins the elections in Gaza in 2006. Blockade, rockets, operations, a cycle that repeats every few years. You know what defines modern Israel? Startup nation. More startups per capita than any other country in the world. Technologies, medicine, cybersecurity, and at the same time bomb shelters in every house. Children who know how to reach a shelter in 15 seconds. A country that sends satellites into space and hides children in basements. 2 Israels in 1. October 2023. The Hamas attack, the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. The retaliatory operation in Gaza, massive destruction, thousands dead on both sides. The world is divided. Some see the right to self-defense, others see a disproportionate response. There is no consensus, no solution, no peace. 2,000 years, from the temple to the Wailing Wall, from dispersion to return, from a dead language to a startup nation. The people who were supposed to disappear did not disappear, returned to the same land, to the same walls, and discovered that the land was not empty, that another people also call it home, and that one land cannot accommodate 2 homes. You know, in 2000 years, everyone who tried to resolve this conflict has failed. Romans, Crusaders, Ottomans, British, the UN, Americans, all of them. Maybe there is no solution. Maybe there is, but we haven't found it yet. Maybe it's a question that history doesn't have an answer to yet. One thing is certain. 2,000 years and both sides are still here. The Jews did not disappear in 2,000 years of diaspora. The Palestinians did not disappear in 75 years of conflict. Both sides stubbornly refuse to leave. Both consider this land their own. Both are right and both are wrong at the same time. You know, maybe that's the problem. When both sides are right, there is no solution. There is only a compromise that neither side wants. 2,000 years, one land, 2 peoples, each with a right to pain, each with a right to a home, and not a single solution that wouldn't cause pain to someone. You know, history usually provides answers about who won, who lost, who was right. Here it doesn't, because here everyone is right and everyone is wrong at the same time. Subscribe and write in the comments which moment from 2,000 years affected you the most. Masada, the revival of a dead language, the 6-Day War, or 700,000 who lost their homes and are still waiting. Personally, I can't stop thinking about Herzl, the journalist who stood in the crowd in Paris, listened to the cries and realized, that's it, enough waiting, it's time to build. And 50 years after his death, the state he envisioned became a reality. You know, sometimes one person's idea changes the world. The only question is, at what cost?